She had 48 hours to become a wife, or lose the daughter she'd never met. Rowan Creed hadn't set foot in town in 3 years. He smelled like pine smoke and old grief, and every person in the general store took a step back when he came through the door. But he wasn't there to frighten anyone. He was holding a telegram with shaking hands, and the words on it were destroying him one line at a time. Daughter, 7 years old, mother deceased, placement pending. He had one chance, one impossible ask. He turned to the only person in Redemption Ridge who might say yes. "I need a wife," he said. "Not forever, just long enough to save her. If you've ever loved someone you didn't deserve, stay with me. Like this video and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels." The telegram had arrived on a Tuesday, which Rowan Creed would later decide was the cruelest detail of the whole thing. Tuesdays were nothing days. He came down from the mountain on Tuesdays to pick up supplies and get back before dark, and he'd done it the same way for 3 years without incident. He tied his horse, went into Whitmore's general store, handed over his list, and waited while Frank Whitmore filled the order without making much conversation, which was the arrangement they'd settled into and which suited Rowan fine. But Frank had handed him the telegram before the flour, and Rowan had stood there in the middle of the store reading it twice, then a third time, and the words had not changed. Mr. Rowan Creed, Redemption Ridge, Colorado Territory. Alara Voss died Thursday last. Fever. She named you father of the child Juniper, age 7. Child currently in care of county. Placement at Harlan Orphanage scheduled for 30 days, hence unless suitable guardian can be confirmed. Proof of stable household required. You may contact Deputy Assessor Hugh Cleary, Durango office, for details of requirements. County Administration, La Plata County. He read it a 4th time. His hands were steadier than they had any right to be. Alara. He hadn't spoken that name out loud in years. He'd thought about her in the abstract way you think about a wound after it's mostly healed, aware it's there, aware it changed the shape of something. But he hadn't let himself sit with it. She'd left Redemption Ridge 8 years ago, and he hadn't gone after her, and that was a choice he'd made and lived with. He'd told himself she was better off. He'd told himself a lot of things. He hadn't known about any child. That was the part that kept snagging. 7 years old meant she'd been born less than a year after Alara left. The math wasn't complicated. What was complicated was the fact that Alara had known his address. Everyone knew his address. He was the hermit on the mountain, a local feature like the old lightning-struck pine on Hatcher's Pass. And she'd never written, never sent word. He didn't know what to do with that. He filed it away in the place he kept things he couldn't do anything about and focused on what was in front of him. 30 days? A child? An orphanage? Frank was watching him from behind the counter with the careful expression of a man who wanted to ask but had enough sense not to. "You know of anyone named Cleary in the county office?" Rowan asked. "Deputy Assessor?" "Heard the name. Don't know him personal." Rowan set the telegram on the counter. He needed to think. He was not by any measure a man equipped for thinking in a room full of people. There were 4 other customers in the store, a woman by the dry goods shelf, and 3 men near the door, and all of them had gone a little quiet when he came in, which was normal, which he'd stopped resenting years ago. He took up space differently than other people. He was aware of that. "What's the requirement?" he said, mostly to himself. "Stable household. What does that mean?" "Means a proper home situation," Frank said, since apparently the question had been audible. "Married man, place to live, means to provide. That's what they look at." Rowan looked up. Frank must have seen something in his face, because the older man held up both hands. "Now I'm just saying what I know. That's how the county does it. A single man living alone in the backcountry isn't what they'd consider. I know what they'd consider." He picked up the telegram. He stood there for another moment, and the woman by the dry goods shelf was pretending very hard to examine a bolt of calico fabric, and the 3 men near the door had found something interesting to look at through the window. Rowan Creed had not asked anyone for anything in 3 years. He had organized his entire life around not needing to. He'd built the cabin himself, maintained it himself, grown what he could and hunted the rest. And on the Tuesdays when he came to town, he was polite and transactional and gone within the hour. He did not attend socials. He did not accept dinner invitations. He had turned down 2 separate attempts by well-meaning townswomen to introduce him to their daughters or nieces or widowed friends, and he'd done it gently, but without leaving room for a second attempt. He thought about a 7-year-old girl in a county office in Durango. He thought about what an orphanage was. He thought about what he owed. "Is Serafina Vale still in town?" he asked. Frank blinked. "Miss Vale? Yeah, she's got the room above the schoolhouse. They let her stay on even after she stopped teaching. Why?" Rowan didn't answer that. He folded the telegram, put it in his coat pocket, and walked out of the store without his flower. He'd seen Serafina Vale maybe a dozen times in 3 years. She came to the store on Saturdays. She kept a garden on the south side of the schoolhouse that she tended in the mornings. She sometimes sat on the bench outside the post office reading a book. And when she saw him, she would nod, and he would nod back, and that was the entirety of their relationship. She'd come to Redemption Ridge about a year after he had. He knew that much from things Frank had said in passing. She'd been a teacher somewhere east, Kansas, he thought, or maybe Missouri, and she'd come west under circumstances that nobody quite knew and that she didn't volunteer. She'd taken the teaching position and held it for a year before something had happened, some kind of disagreement with the school board, and after that she'd just stayed. She did odd work, mending, correspondence, helping Alma Whitmore with the store accounts. She was quiet in the way people are quiet when they've decided that being noticed costs too much. He understood that way of being quiet. It was the same way he was quiet. He found her in the garden. She was on her knees in the dirt, turning over soil with a hand trowel, and she had a smudge of mud on her jaw, and her hair was coming loose from its pins, and she looked up when she heard him coming and went very still. He stopped a few feet away. He hadn't thought about how to start this. "Miss Vale," he said. "Mr. Creed." Her voice was even. Most people's voices went a little uncertain when they talked to him. Hers didn't, which he'd noticed before. "Is something wrong? I need to ask you something. It's going to sound—" He stopped, started again. "I don't know how to ask it except to just ask it." She set down the trowel. She stayed where she was, kneeling in the dirt, looking up at him with dark eyes that were waiting without any particular alarm. He took out the telegram and held it toward her. She read it slowly. He watched her face and saw the moment she understood what he was standing in front of her for, and her expression did something complicated. Not shock exactly, more like a door opening onto a very cold room. "You're asking me to marry you," she said. "I'm asking you to help me keep a child out of an orphanage." "That's the same thing. It's a legal arrangement," he said. I'm not expecting anything from you except your name on a document and your presence in the house when the county assessor comes to inspect. After that, if you want to dissolve it, I'll make that easy for you. You'd have the cabin and whatever you needed from me. I'd go." She looked at the telegram again. "You didn't know about her?" "No." "And her mother, it didn't work out. She left. I didn't know she was carrying a child." He paused. "I'm not asking you to believe I'm a good man. I'm asking you to help a 7-year-old girl who didn't do anything wrong." Serafina was quiet for a moment. A bird went off somewhere in the pine trees behind the schoolhouse. Wind came through and lifted a loose strand of her hair across her face, and she didn't move to brush it away. "What would I tell people?" she asked. "Whatever you want. The truth is simple enough. 2 people married quick so a child would have a home." "People will talk. People already talk. About both of us." He watched her. "I wouldn't ask this if I had another option." "I know you wouldn't." She was still reading the telegram, though she'd clearly already finished it. "When would we need to— When does the assessor come?" "I'd have to write to Durango and find that out, but the 30-day window is already running." She looked up at him then, directly, and he made himself hold her gaze. He was not a man who found that easy. "I have conditions," she said. Something in his chest released, just slightly. "Name them." "I'm not a housekeeper. I cook my share and clean my share, and you do the same." "Fine. If the child needs schooling, I'll provide it, but you don't interfere with how I teach." "Fine. And if at any point I feel unsafe—" She said it plainly, without accusation, just stating a fact that needed stating. "I leave. No questions, no argument." He nodded. "You won't." "I'll decide that." "Fair enough." She finally stood up, brushing the dirt off her knees. She was smaller than he'd registered before, standing this close. The top of her head came to about his collarbone. She handed the telegram back to him. "All right," she said. He hadn't expected it to be that quick. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. "You're sure?" "I'm not sure of anything." She said it without self-pity, just as information. "But she's 7 years old and she just lost her mother, and if I can do something about that, I should." She picked up her trowel. "Come by tomorrow morning. We can go to the Justice of the Peace before the post office opens and write to the county office after." He stood there for another second, feeling like he should say more, like there was something appropriate to say in a moment like this. Nothing came. "Thank you," he said finally. She nodded and went back to her digging. They married the next morning in a room off the back of Judge Pratton's house, with Frank Whitmore and his wife Alma as witnesses, because Rowan had asked Frank, and Frank had told Alma, and Alma had simply shown up, which was how Alma Whitmore operated. The ceremony was brief. Judge Pratton read the necessary words, Rowan and Serafina said the necessary words back, and Frank signed the paper and Alma cried a little, which seemed to embarrass her. Serafina wore a dark blue dress that she'd clearly put on with some care, and her hair was up properly, and she looked composed in the way someone looks composed when they've made a decision and are committed to it. Rowan wore his good shirt, which was the flannel one, without the mended tear at the collar. He'd been aware of the inadequacy of this before they went in, and he'd been more aware of it after Alma asked if there would be a celebration supper, and Serafina had said, "Not tonight, Alma, thank you," in a tone that closed the subject gently but completely. They walked to the post office after and composed the letter to Deputy Assessor Cleary together, standing at the small writing desk they had there for public use. Serafina wrote it out in a clear, careful hand that was much better than his. She stated the facts without embellishment. They were married, they had a home, they wished to provide a stable situation for the child Juniper pending formal inspection, and they requested information on the process and timeline. Rowan watched her write and thought that she was very good at saying necessary things without making them feel like more than they were. "You should know the cabin isn't much," he said while she was sealing the envelope. "You said that." "I've got a main room, 2 smaller rooms, a good stove, running water from the creek with a pipe I put in 2 years ago. It's sound. I built it to last, not to look like anything. I don't need it to look like anything. It's a day's ride into the mountains, more in bad weather." She looked up at him. "Mr. Creed." "Rowan. Rowan." She said it carefully, like a word in a new language. "I understand what I've agreed to. I'm not going to be surprised by the conditions." He nodded. "I just wanted you to have a fair picture." "I appreciate that." She handed the envelope to the postmistress. "What do you know about her? Juniper?" He was quiet for a moment. "Only what the telegram says, 7 years old. Her mother named her after the tree, probably. Elara liked that kind of thing, names with meaning." He stopped. "I don't know what she looks like. I don't know what she's like. I don't know what she's been told about me." "She's been through something terrible," Serafina said. "However she arrives, that's what she's carrying. That's the starting point." "Yes. Then that's what we work with." He thought about her way of saying that, "that's what we work with," like it was simple, like it was just a matter of identifying the problem and addressing it. He didn't know if she believed it was that simple, or if she was just a person who led with practical thinking as a way of getting through things. Either way, he found it useful. They went back to the store and he picked up his flour, and she picked up a few things of her own, and Alma made one more attempt at the celebration supper question, and they both declined, and they went their separate ways for the day since there was no reason to do otherwise. He rode back up the mountain that evening with the supplies and the signed marriage certificate in his coat pocket, and sat for a long time on the porch, looking out at the pine forest going dark under a flat gray sky. He was 34 years old. He'd spent the last 3 years trying to want as little as possible from the world, and it had worked well enough. He'd built something that worked, the cabin, the routines, the careful distances, and he told himself that was sufficient. Now there was a woman whose name he'd signed alongside his own on a legal document, and in 3 weeks or 4 there would be a child coming up the mountain who had every reason to hate him, and the life he'd built to keep things simple had just gotten complicated beyond anything he'd prepared for. He stayed on the porch until it was too cold to stay. Serafina packed her things in 2 days. She didn't have much, a trunk of clothes, her books, which numbered 31, and which she arranged in the trunk with the careful logic of someone who had moved them before and knew how they fit. A small box of personal items that she did not inventory in front of anyone. A bundle of dried herbs from the garden, tied with string. She told Alma Whitmore where she was going and endured Alma's questions with patience and answered the ones she could answer honestly and deflected the rest. Alma was not a cruel woman. She was, in fact, one of the kinder people in Redemption Ridge. But she was a thorough one, and thorough kindness could feel like a lot to stand still under. "He's not a bad man," Alma said, and she said it with the emphasis of someone correcting a misconception that hadn't actually been stated. "I didn't say he was," Serafina replied. "He had that business with the mine years back. The Callaway mine accident. You know about it?" She did, in the general way you know about things in a small town. 3 men dead. A collapse that happened on Rowan Creed's watch, because Rowan Creed had been the foreman. She knew that much and not much more. "He blamed himself," Alma said. "The inquiry cleared him. Wasn't negligence, just bad luck of the mountain. But he didn't accept the clearing. He left his position and went up there and mostly didn't come back. You're telling me this because I'm telling you because you should know who you're living with." Alma folded her hands on the counter. "He's not dangerous. He's a man who carries something heavy and doesn't put it down. There's a difference." Serafina considered that. "I know the difference," she said. She did know it. She'd been carrying something of her own for long enough to know what it looked like in another person. He came for her and her trunk on a Wednesday morning with the wagon, and they rode out of Redemption Ridge while most of the town was still having breakfast. The road climbed steadily for the first 2 hours, following the creek, and then left the creek and got steeper. And by noon they were in the dense pines above the tree line, and the air had changed to that cold, clean sharpness that meant altitude. They talked intermittently. Not uncomfortably, she thought, just the conversation of 2 people who didn't see the need to fill silence for its own sake, which was a quality she appreciated. "What was it like?" she asked at one point. "Teaching." He glanced at her. "I haven't taught. I meant for me. You were asking, earlier." He hadn't been, but she'd assumed the question was there and decided to answer it. "I liked it. I was good at it. The children in the Valley School in Kansas were—" She paused. "I miss them sometimes, the good ones." "Why did you stop?" She was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, he thought, just choosing her words. "There was a situation," she said, "with the school board. I made a decision they didn't agree with." She looked at the road ahead. "I protected a student. The board felt I'd overstepped. The student's family was connected and I wasn't, and that was the end of it." He didn't ask what the situation was. She didn't offer more. They let it rest. "The children here weren't bad either," she said. "Redemption Ridge children. I liked them fine." "Then why did you stop teaching here too?" "Same board, different territory." The corners of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. "I seem to have a problem with school boards." He made a sound that might, in a different man, have been a laugh. It was less than that, more like an acknowledgement, but she noticed it. The cabin appeared late in the afternoon, set against a ridge face with the pine forest behind it and a meadow opening out in front, and Serafina stood up a little in the wagon seat to see it better. He'd described it accurately. It was plain, substantial, built with the logic of function over form. But there were details he hadn't mentioned. Window boxes, empty now in the shoulder of autumn. A porch that ran the full width of the front face, with 2 chairs. A woodpile stacked to the eaves and covered with oilcloth. A garden plot, harvested and put to bed for winter, with wire fencing. He'd been here alone, and he'd still built it like a place where people lived. She thought about that and didn't say anything about it. He showed her the rooms. The main room was large, with the stove at one end and a table near the window and bookshelves that ran along the inner wall. More books than she'd expected. A serious collection. The spines worn with reading. The 2 smaller rooms were off the back, each with a window and a bed. "I thought you'd want the one on the south side," he said. "More light." "Thank you." He'd put a washstand in it and a small mirror, and there was a braided rug on the floor that was relatively new. She could see it was newer than the rest of the furnishings, placed deliberately, and she understood without him saying it that he'd put it there for whoever was going to occupy this room. either for her or for Juniper, and he'd given it to her. She unpacked her trunk while he dealt with the horse and wagon. When she came back out to the main room, he was at the stove making something that smelled like venison stew, and he looked up briefly and said, 40 minutes. And she sat down at the table with one of her books, and the ease of that, the simple ordinariness of two people in a kitchen doing separate things, surprised her a little. The letter from Deputy Assessor Cleary arrived 11 days later, when Rowan had ridden down to collect the mail. He read it on horseback on the way back up because he couldn't wait, and he read it again at the kitchen table while Serafina made coffee. Cleary would bring Juniper personally. He would also conduct the household inspection at that time. The date was in 12 days. If the situation was satisfactory, custody would be granted on a provisional basis with a follow-up inspection in 90 days. 12 days. Serafina read the letter and set it down and said, "All right. She's coming here directly," he said. "Not to town. He's bringing her up the mountain." "Then we should be ready." He'd been thinking about the room. The south room was Serafina's now, which left the north room. He'd been sleeping there himself, but he'd moved to a cot in the main room 2 days after she arrived, because having her in the house had made him aware that the arrangement of rooms was awkward, and the cot in the main room was the straightforward solution. The north room needed something. A child's room needed something he hadn't provided yet. "I have things," he said. Serafina looked at him. He went to the back corner of the main room, where a wooden chest sat against the wall that she'd assumed held tools or winter supplies. He opened it and she came to stand beside him and looked in. It was full of children's things. Not random, deliberate. There were carved wooden animals, a whole shelf's worth, bears and horses, and a bird with wings that actually spread. There were books, small ones, picture books, and early readers. There was a bundle of cloth that turned out to be a quilt, small scale, made with the same care as the woodwork. And at the bottom, a few pieces of clothing. Small dresses, folded, sized for a girl of about 4 or 5. He hadn't known about Juniper, and yet he'd been building these things, buying these books, making this quilt for years. Serafina didn't say anything for a moment. She reached out and picked up one of the carved animals. A bear, seated, its expression something between dignified and curious, and turned it in her hands. "You didn't know about her," she said. "No." "Then who were these for?" He was quiet. He picked up a book from the chest and looked at the cover. Stories from the Mountain West for young readers. "I don't know," he said. "I kept thinking. I thought about the fact that she might exist, that there might be a child somewhere that was mine. I never had any way to find out, and I couldn't let myself think it too directly." He put the book back. "I made things. It was easier than thinking." She set the bear down carefully on top of the chest. She looked at him, a full look, the kind she'd been keeping careful and measured since they'd met, and something in it shifted. "We should put these in the room," she said. "She should see them when she arrives." He nodded. They spent the afternoon arranging the north room. She hung the quilt on the wall where it would be the first thing seen from the door. He put the carved animals on the windowsill where the light caught them. She positioned the books on the small shelf he'd already built into the wall, spine out so they could be read. When they were done, they stood in the doorway looking at it, and it looked like a room that had been waiting. The night before Cleary was due to arrive, Rowan sat on the porch long after dark, and Serafina came out after a while with 2 cups of coffee and sat in the other chair and handed him one. It was cold. The stars were very clear. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "The mine accident. 3 men died. Eames Colby, Will Drury, and Pete Drury, who was Will's younger brother. I was the foreman. The inquiry said it was geological, a fault line that wasn't on any survey, couldn't have been anticipated. And that was true." He drank the coffee. It was too hot, and he drank it anyway. "But the night before there'd been sounds in that shaft. Sounds that usually mean instability. I knew them. Every foreman in the territory knew them, and I was tired and behind on the quota, and I told myself it was nothing." Serafina was very still. "It wasn't nothing," he said. "I don't know if I could have saved them. I don't know if I'd gotten there early and pulled them out, whether the collapse would have happened the same day or the next or the one after. I don't know. But I made a choice that night that I can't make not made, And those 3 men had families, and Will Drury's wife had 4 children, and the youngest was 2. He stopped. So when you hear people in town say the inquiry cleared me, that's true. That doesn't mean I'm cleared. Serafina held her cup in both hands. She looked at the dark tree line. I'm not telling you so you'll feel sorry for me, he said. I'm telling you because you're in my house and we have a child coming tomorrow, and you should know what kind of man you're attached to. A man who made a bad call once, she said, under exhaustion and pressure. A call that killed people. Yes. She didn't soften it. And you've been punishing yourself for it for 3 years, in the most isolated and thorough way you could arrange. She looked at him. I'm not saying you were right. I'm saying I understand it. He didn't say anything. I made a bad choice once too, she said. Not the same scale, but the kind that changes things permanently. She shook her head slightly. I'm not telling you what it was. I'm just telling you I understand the weight of it. He nodded. They sat in the cold for a while longer. The fire from inside came through the window glass and laid a warm stripe across the porch boards, and the stars moved their slow rotation over the mountain, and neither of them felt the need to fill the quiet. She might hate me, he said finally. When she gets here. She might. She'd have reason. Yes. I don't know how to be a father. I don't have anything to model that on that's worth modeling. Neither did most fathers, Serafina said. They figured it out as they went, or they didn't, and that was its own kind of lesson. She stood up, taking her cup. She's 7 years old. She lost her mother. She's going to be terrified and angry, and she's going to take it out on whoever is in front of her because that's what people do. She paused at the door. Show up anyway. That's what it looks like from here. Just show up, whatever she does. He sat with that after she went inside. The night was very quiet, the way mountain nights are quiet. Not empty, but full of things that weren't human noise. Wind in the upper pines, water moving somewhere below, an owl making its consideration of the dark. He thought about a 7-year-old girl on a horse or in a wagon, coming up an unfamiliar mountain toward a man she'd never met, and he thought about what that must feel like, and the weight of it settled on him like the cold, which was everywhere and couldn't be argued with. He went inside. He checked the stove, banked the fire for the night, and lay down on the cot in the main room and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow. She arrived at mid-morning. Deputy Assessor Hugh Cleary was a compact, serious man of about 50, with the look of someone who'd seen enough difficult situations to have stopped being surprised by them. He rode a bay gelding, and Juniper rode beside him on a pony that was smaller than either of them looked comfortable with. Rowan saw them coming across the meadow and went still on the porch. Serafina came out beside him and stood there without touching him, which he appreciated. He didn't need steadying, but he was glad she was there. The child came into focus as they got closer. She was small. He didn't know why that surprised him. She had dark hair, loose, tangled from the ride, and her coat was too light for the mountain temperature, and she sat straight on the pony, despite that, with the particular dignity of a child who had decided not to show that she was cold. Her face was her mother's around the eyes. Her jaw was his. He could see that even from the porch. Cleary dismounted and tipped his hat. Mr. Creed. Mrs. Creed. Serafina said, Good morning. You must be cold. Coffee's on the stove. Juniper had not gotten off the pony. She was looking at Rowan with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Not exactly hate, not exactly fear, something that was working very hard at being neither. He walked down the porch steps. He stopped at what felt like the right distance, not too close. Juniper, he said. She looked at him. Up close, her eyes were dark brown, very direct, and they were doing the same thing her posture was doing, working hard at giving nothing away, and not entirely succeeding, because underneath it she looked like what she was, a 7-year-old child who was exhausted and frightened and doing the very best she could. He wanted to say something right. He couldn't think of anything right. He thought of Serafina's advice, show up anyway, and he stood there and let her look at him. You're big, she said finally. Yes. Mama said you were big. He hadn't expected her to say her mother's name so quickly, so plainly. It hit him somewhere in the chest. She mentioned me? Juniper looked away. She said I had your chin. She said it like she wasn't sure if that was a good thing. I didn't want to come here. I know. I only came because Mr. Cleary said I had to. That's fair. I might not stay. She said it with the bravado of a child who had very little actual power and knew it. I might decide to go somewhere else. You can decide how you feel about it after you've had something to eat, he said. You've been riding all morning. She looked at him for another moment, and whatever she'd expected him to say, it wasn't that. And it didn't quite fix anything, but it moved something slightly. She got off the pony. Serafina had come down the steps and was crouching to be at eye level, which struck Rowan as exactly right. I'm Serafina, she said. Are you hungry? Juniper looked at her with somewhat less armor on than she'd used on Rowan. A little. I made biscuits this morning. Come inside. They went in. Rowan took the horses. Hugh Cleary fell into step beside him and said, quietly, She didn't sleep last night. Been holding herself together by will for about 3 days. I can see that. She's a remarkable child. Cleary said it with the same plainness as a man stating facts, not editorializing. Whatever else this is, she's remarkable. He looked at Rowan sideways. Try not to let her down. That's the plan, Rowan said. He didn't say it like it was easy. Hugh Cleary stayed for 3 hours. He walked through this cabin with the careful attention of a man who'd learned not to trust first impressions in either direction, noting the stove, the water pipe, the woodpile, the books, the food stores. He asked Rowan practical questions about the water source and winter provisions and the distance to the nearest settlement, and Rowan answered them plainly without embellishment because embellishment would have been obvious to a man like Cleary anyway. He asked Serafina about her background, her teaching experience, her intentions regarding the child's education, and she answered with the same even composure she brought to most things. Juniper sat at the table through most of this eating biscuits with a focused dedication that suggested she hadn't eaten a proper meal in a while, and periodically she'd look up and watch Cleary moving around the room and then look back down. When Cleary finally settled at the table across from Rowan, he opened his folder and made some notes and then looked up. I'll be direct with you, Mr. Creed. My job is the child's welfare, not anyone's comfort. The household presents adequately. The circumstances are irregular. A recent marriage, a remote location, but irregularity isn't disqualification. He glanced at Juniper, who was pretending not to listen and fooling nobody. The provisional period is 90 days. If the second inspection is satisfactory, custody becomes permanent. Understood, Rowan said. Cleary looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. She's going to be difficult, he said, keeping his voice low. Not because she's a difficult child, because she's been through something no child should go through, and she's been dealing with it alone for 3 weeks. Be patient. I'll try. Cleary stood, collected his folder, and said his goodbyes with the efficiency of a man with a long ride back. Serafina walked him to his horse. Rowan stayed at the table. Juniper was watching him. He's checking on you, she said. He doesn't trust you yet. No, Rowan agreed. He doesn't. She considered this. Do you think he will? After 90 days? That depends on what happens in 90 days. She picked up a biscuit crumb from the table with one finger and looked at it. Mama used to say that trust is earned the same way debt is paid, a little at a time until the balance changes. She didn't look up when she said it. She said it the way children say things they're repeating from memory, from a voice they're trying to keep close. Rowan sat with that. She was right, he said. Juniper finally looked at him. She had questions in her face, a whole stack of them, accumulated over 7 years or at least over the 3 weeks since everything had fallen apart. And she wasn't going to ask them yet, or maybe not today, but they were there. He could see them the same way you can see the shape of something in a room that hasn't been lit yet. He didn't push. He had enough sense for that. There's a room for you, he said, if you want to see it. She stood in the doorway of the north room for a long moment without going in. Serafina had come back inside and was standing slightly behind Rowan in the hallway, and none of them said anything for a little while. The afternoon light was coming through the north window at a low angle, and it caught the carved animals on the sill. The bear, the horses, a fox with its tail curved around its feet, and laid their shadows long and soft across the floor. Juniper stepped in. She went straight to the windowsill and picked up the bear, the same one Serafina had picked up the week before, and turned it in her hands. Her face was doing something very controlled. Who made these? She asked. Rowan was in the doorway. He didn't go in. The room felt like it was hers already, even after 60 seconds. I did. She looked at him. When? Over the past few years? She looked back at the bear. The question she was working toward was obvious, and she was circling it carefully. Did you know about me? When you made them? No, he said. I didn't. Then who were they for? He'd thought about how to answer this, and he decided to answer it honestly, even though honest was harder. I didn't know. I just made them. I thought... He stopped. I used to think that maybe somewhere there was a child who was mine. I had no way to know, so I made things for that possibility. Juniper looked at the bear for a long time. That's strange, she said finally. Yes, but not bad strange. She set it back on the sill with a precision that suggested she'd decided it had a right place. She went to the shelf and looked at the books, tilting her head to read the spines. Mama read to me every night, she said, until she got sick. Before she got sick, she never missed. She pulled out one of the books, Mountain Folk Tales, illustrated, and opened it and looked at the pictures. She liked stories. She said they were how people kept things from disappearing. Serafina made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. Rowan looked at the floor. Juniper closed the book and held it against her chest. Can I keep this one in here? All of them are yours, Rowan said. Everything in this room is yours. She looked up at him, and for just a second the armor was completely down, and what was underneath it was just a child who was very tired and very sad and trying so hard to be otherwise. Then it went back up. Not all the way. There was a crack in it now that hadn't been there an hour ago, but enough that she looked like herself again, whatever herself was becoming. All right, she said, I'll stay. For now. The first week was hard, in the way that things are hard when everyone is trying. Juniper woke up crying twice that first week, the kind of crying that happened in sleep before you could stop it. Both times Serafina went to her. The first time Rowan heard it from the main room and lay on his cot, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to Serafina's low voice through the wall, and the crying slowly subsiding. The second time he got up and went to stand in the hallway, not to go in, just to be closer, which he recognized was irrational, but he stood there anyway until it was quiet. In the days, Juniper managed herself with a wariness that was exhausting to watch. She was polite. She helped clear the table without being asked. She said please and thank you with the automatic diligence of a child who had been taught manners as a form of self-protection. She answered questions in full sentences and asked her own questions when something confused her. But all of it had that quality of careful, managed presentation, like she was performing the role of a child who was doing fine. She was not doing fine. Anyone could see that. But she was holding herself together, and Rowan understood that particular project, the long, disciplined effort of keeping something intact through will alone. And he didn't try to dismantle it. Serafina began teaching her on the fourth day, not formally, just sideways. She mentioned a thing about the creek, and Juniper asked why, and they ended up spending an hour at the table with a piece of paper Serafina drew on, explaining water tables and elevation and snowmelt in the spring. Juniper asked good questions, sharp ones, and Serafina answered them without talking down, and by the time Rowan came in for lunch, they were both bent over the paper arguing, in a friendly way, about whether the creek would run year-round or go shallow in a dry summer. He would know, Serafina said, nodding toward Rowan. They both looked at him. It's run year-round for 3 years, he said. There was one dry August where it got slow, still ran. Juniper looked at Serafina. See? I didn't disagree, Serafina said mildly. I said I wasn't sure. You made a face like you disagreed. I have resting, uncertain face. It's different. Juniper considered this with great seriousness and then made a sound. Not quite a laugh, more like a laugh starting and thinking better of it, and went back to the drawing on the paper. But it was there, that sound, and it was the first one. Rowan put a pot on the stove and didn't make anything of it, because making something of it would have ended it. The trouble started at the end of the first week, as trouble generally does. Not with a dramatic event, but with something small and sideways. Rowan had been splitting wood in the yard, and Juniper had come out to watch, which she'd been doing in the afternoons, not engaging, just present. He didn't comment on it. She would sit on the porch step with a book open that she wasn't reading and watch him work. And he would work. and the arrangement had a strange comfort to it despite everything. That day she put the book down and said, "Why did you leave?" He set the axe down. He'd been expecting the question. He hadn't been expecting it to come that bluntly or that quickly. "Leave where?" he said, though he knew. "Mama, you left, and you didn't come back." She was looking at him with that directness that must have been his, because Alara had been a circler. She went at hard things from the side. This child went straight. She never said why. She'd changed the subject. But you left, and she was alone. And then she got sick, and there was nobody. There was nobody. He heard that and felt it go into him like something with an edge. "I didn't leave," he said. It's not that simple. She was alone." "I know. She worked herself sick. She took in laundry and sewing, and she kept saying she was fine, but she worked too hard, and then she got the fever, and there was nobody to help her, and I was by myself for 4 days before the neighbors came." Juniper's voice was completely flat and steady, and it was the most frightening thing he'd heard in years. 4 days, I was 7. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. "So I want to know why," she said. "Why you left and didn't come back. Not the complicated version, the real one." He crouched down so he wasn't looming, so they were closer to the same level. She didn't back up. "Your mother and I—" He stopped, started again. "We didn't work. We tried, for a while. It was bad between us at the end. Not violent, not like that, just we made each other worse than we were. She was unhappy here, and I didn't know how to fix that, and I made it worse trying. She left. I didn't go after her because she asked me not to, and because I thought he heard how this was going to sound. He said it anyway. I thought she'd be better off." Juniper stared at him. "You thought she'd be better off alone. I thought she'd be better off without me specifically. He rubbed his face. "I was not doing well, after the mine. I was not a good thing to be around. I thought I was doing right by her. She was alone. Yes. That wasn't right." "No," he said. It wasn't. She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her working through something, turning it, looking at all the angles with the fierce attention of a child who took things seriously. "Did you love her?" she asked. "Yes. Not the way I should have, maybe. Not well enough. But yes." Juniper picked up her book. She stood up from the step and looked at him once more, and then went inside, and he stayed crouched in the yard for a moment before he stood up and picked up the axe again. His hands were not steady. He talked to Serafina about it that night after Juniper was asleep. Not the whole conversation, just the edges of it, enough that she understood. She listened without interrupting, which he appreciated, and when he was done, she was quiet for a moment. "She's not wrong," Serafina said. "I know. She's also not asking you to defend yourself. She's asking you to acknowledge it." "I did." "Did you?" He thought about the conversation. "I tried." "There's a difference between explaining and acknowledging," Serafina said. She wasn't unkind when she said it. She said it the way she said most things, like it was just information, observable fact. Explaining is, here's what happened and why. Acknowledging is, you were hurt, and that was because of me, and there's nothing I can say that changes it. She looked at him. "She doesn't need the explanation. She already has it. What she needs is for you to not argue about the weight of what it cost her." He sat with that. "I don't know how to do that," he said honestly. "I think you do," Serafina said. "I think you're just afraid that if you stop defending yourself, there's nothing left." He didn't answer. She wasn't wrong about that either. The second week found its rhythm, ragged as it was. Juniper began helping Serafina cook in the mornings, which started accidentally when she wandered into the kitchen too early, and Serafina handed her an apron and put her to work on the biscuit dough without ceremony. She had opinions about the dough. Her mother had made biscuits differently, with lard instead of butter, and she explained this at some length while Serafina listened with genuine interest and adjusted accordingly, and the resulting biscuits were arguably better, which Juniper pointed out. "Your mother was right," Serafina said. Juniper looked pleased and then looked like she didn't mean to look pleased, and then looked at the biscuits instead. In the afternoons, the lessons continued, ranging wherever Juniper's questions led. She was quick, faster than most children Serafina had taught, with the particular quickness of a child who had learned from someone who loved learning, because Alar's devotion to stories and ideas had clearly been passed down intact. She read well above her age. She had gaps in mathematics that Serafina began filling in with the same sideways approach, slipping arithmetic into practical problems. How much flour for this recipe doubled, how many fence posts for that perimeter, so that the numbers had a reason to exist. Rowan watched all of this from a careful distance. He was present, consistently, deliberately present, in the way Serafina had said to be. But he didn't push himself into her space. He was there in the mornings when she woke up. He was there at meals. He was there in the evenings when Serafina read aloud by the fire, which had become the new nightly ritual, the three of them in the main room with the wood stove going, and Serafina's voice steady and clear, and Juniper curled at the end of the sofa with her eyes half closed, pretending she wasn't falling asleep. He couldn't tell if any of it was working. He had no frame of reference for this. He'd never been anyone's father. He'd never been around children much at all, and the ones he'd been around had not been in the specific situation of grieving and suspicious and 7 years old and required to trust a stranger. He did the things he could do. He fixed things. He maintained the water pipe when it started dripping. He made sure the fire never went out overnight. He sharpened Serafina's kitchen knives without being asked and left them on the counter. When the pony Juniper had arrived on developed a thrown shoe, he reshod it in the yard while Juniper watched from the fence. And when she asked could she help hold the hoof, he said yes and showed her how. And she was quiet and focused and good at it, and he told her so. "Mama said I had good hands," she said, not looking up from the hoof. She was right. A silence. "She said that about you too," Juniper said, "that you had good hands. She said that's how she knew you when she first met you. She said you fixed something for her before you even introduced yourself." He remembered that. A wagon wheel, her first week in town, 8 years ago. She'd been trying to manage it herself and not getting anywhere, and he'd just taken it from her and fixed it and handed it back. And she'd laughed and said, "You could at least tell me your name first," and that had been the start of everything. "A wagon wheel," he said. Juniper looked up at him then, and something happened in her face. Not softening exactly, but a kind of recognition, like she'd been checking a fact and it had come back confirmed. "She told me that story," she said, "more than once." He set the hoof down and straightened up and didn't say anything, because anything he said right now would be the wrong thing, and the silence was the right thing, so he let it stand. 3 weeks in, Juniper got sick. Not the illness that would come later, just a child's fever, the kind that burns for 2 days and breaks on the third. But she woke up burning and miserable and calling for her mother in that half-awake, confused way that made Rowan stop in the hallway like he'd walked into a wall, because she wasn't calling for Serafina, she was calling for Alara, and there was nothing anyone could do about that. Serafina was already in the room before him. He stood in the doorway and watched her settle on the edge of the bed and put her hand on Juniper's forehead and say, quietly, "I've got you. You're all right." And Juniper grabbed her wrist and held on and didn't let go. He went and made the broth. It was the one thing he could do. He'd learned it from necessity. Sick animals, sick neighbors when he was young, and he did it carefully, the long, slow kind that had substance to it. He brought it in when it was done and set it on the side table, and Serafina looked up and nodded. He stayed in the house all that day. He didn't go out for wood or water or any of the usual things. He stayed within range, in the main room mostly, doing small tasks with no particular urgency, and when Serafina came out at noon and sat at the table looking tired, he put coffee in front of her without being asked, and she wrapped both hands around the cup and closed her eyes for a moment. "She's asking for her mother," Serafina said. "I heard. She knows. In the part of her that's awake, she knows. But the part that's sick doesn't." She opened her eyes. "I told her I was here. I don't know if that's enough." "It's something," he said. She drank the coffee. "You're good with her," he said. He said it because it was true, and because she looked like someone who needed to hear a true thing. Serafina made a small motion with her head that wasn't quite acceptance. "I'm doing what's in front of me." "That's what good with her looks like," he said. She looked at him for a second with an expression he couldn't entirely read. "Go check on her," she said. "She might be more awake now." He went. Juniper was propped on the pillow and her eyes were open and she looked terrible, feverish and pale, and like she hadn't slept properly in weeks, which was probably true. She looked at him when he came in and didn't say anything, He sat in the chair by the bed. It was Serafina's chair for the night, pulled close, and he sat in it because there wasn't anywhere else. "How are you feeling?" he asked, which was a stupid question, but the kind you asked anyway. "Bad," she said with the directness he'd come to expect from her. "The broth helped some?" "A little." She was quiet. She was looking at the ceiling. "I dreamed about Mama." He didn't rush to fill the space. "We were in the kitchen back home," she said. "She was making the biscuits, the lard kind." Her voice was rough from fever. "It was just normal, nothing important. She was just there." She stopped. "Then I woke up and she wasn't." He didn't say it would be all right. He didn't say she'd be with her in her dreams, or that she was watching over her, or any of the things people said when they didn't know what else to say, because those things would have been exactly the wrong things. "That's the hardest kind of dream," he said. "The ordinary ones." She looked at him. "Did you ever dream about people you lost?" "Yes." "Does it stop?" He was quiet for a moment. He owed her honesty. "It changes," he said. "It doesn't stop. But it changes. The ordinary dreams start to feel like gifts instead of tricks." He paused. "Eventually." She thought about that. How long is eventually? Different for everyone. He looked at her and she looked back at him, and they were both just people sitting with a hard truth in a room, and there was something in that. The simplicity of it, the lack of performance, that felt more real than most of the careful managed interactions they'd had in 3 weeks. "Okay," she said, finally, like she was filing the answer away for later use. She fell asleep again shortly after. He sat there until she was fully under, and then he got up and went back out to the main room, and Serafina was at the table with her book open and not reading it, and she looked up when he came out. "Okay?" she asked. "She's sleeping." He stopped in the middle of the room. He didn't know exactly how to say what he wanted to say, which was that something had shifted in the last hour. Something small but real, the kind of shift you feel before you can explain it. "I think she might be starting to let me in," he said. "Just the edge of it." Serafina looked at him with the quiet attention she brought to things that mattered. "Don't press it," she said. "I know. And don't get ahead of yourself." "I know that too." She looked back at her book. "Good," she said, which was not a dismissal. He'd learned to hear the difference. It was the same as saying, "I believe you. Now let it develop on its own." The fire in the stove made its small sounds. Outside, the mountain dark was complete and total, and the cabin was the only lit thing in it, and the three of them were in here together, which was not what any of them had planned, and which was, for all its difficulty, the beginning of something real. Juniper's fever broke on the 3rd day, as fevers do when they're the ordinary kind. Not dramatically, not with any clear turning point, just a morning where she woke up and the heat had gone out of her and she was hungry instead of miserable. She ate 2 bowls of the broth and half a piece of bread and announced that she felt better in the tone of someone reporting a weather change, and Serafina pressed her palm to her forehead once more and nodded and said, "Good." And that was the end of the sickness. What it left behind was harder to name. Something had loosened in the 3 days of fever and nighttime watches, and Rowan, sitting in the chair by the bed, saying ordinary things into the dark. It wasn't trust exactly. It was more like the removal of one layer of the thing that kept trust from forming. Juniper still watched him carefully. She still had the habit of going quiet when he came into a room, measuring, calculating. But she'd stopped flinching when he moved suddenly, and she'd started answering his questions with more than the minimum. And twice in the week after the fever, she'd come to find him specifically, once to ask about a bird she'd seen from the window, once to show him a drawing she'd made, instead of routing everything through Serafina. He didn't make anything of it. He answered the questions, looked at the drawing, said it was good because it was, and let her go. He was learning that with Juniper, the worst thing he could do was show her that her small offerings mattered to him too much. She needed to be able to give things without being crushed under the weight of his gratitude. October arrived and the mountain changed around them. The aspens went gold in the upper stands, and then the gold went brown, and the leaves came down in the morning wind, and the temperature dropped in a way that was no longer just crisp but pointed, a reminder of what was coming. Rowan doubled the wood splitting. Juniper started asking to help, and he showed her how, scaled down, short pieces, a lighter maul. And she was worse at it than she wanted to be and frustrated by that, which he understood, and he told her it took time in a way that was matter-of-fact rather than comforting, and she responded better to that. Serafina had moved the lessons inside entirely now and expanded them into the afternoons. Juniper's appetite for it was difficult to keep up with. She chased every thread, pulled every question into three more, and had the particular stubbornness of a bright child who had been bored for a long time and was now making up for it. She and Serafina had arguments about things, history, mostly, the why of it, and the arguments were genuine. Each of them actually invested, and Rowan would sit on the other side of the room and listen, and occasionally, if he had something worth saying, say it. One afternoon they were arguing about whether the mountain tribes who had lived in this territory before the settlements had made better use of the land or worse, and it had gotten heated in the way only an 8-year-old and a former schoolteacher can make a geography argument heated, and Rowan said, from the sofa where he was mending a piece of harness, "They knew what the land could do. We mostly learned what we could take from it. There's a difference." Both of them went quiet and looked at him. "That's what happened with the mine," he said. He hadn't meant to say it. He said it anyway. "We took what we thought we could and didn't ask if the mountain agreed." Juniper was looking at him with that full attention look. "Is that why it collapsed?" "Partly. The geology was bad. Faulted rock we didn't know about. But we knew there were signs and we pushed past them." He went back to the harness. "That's not the mountain's fault." Juniper was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Serafina says you blamed yourself." "Juniper," Serafina said, in the tone that meant we talked about this privately. "She didn't say I couldn't ask," Juniper said, which was technically true and logically airtight, and Serafina had no immediate answer for it. Rowan looked up from the harness. "She's right that I blame myself." "Did you do something wrong?" "I made a call I shouldn't have made. 3 men died because of it." He said it plainly, not for sympathy, just as fact. The inquiry said it wasn't negligence. I've never been able to fully agree with the inquiry. Juniper thought about this with the thoroughness he'd come to expect from her. "Mama said you were a good man who had a hard time accepting being human," she said. The room went very still. "She said that?" he asked. "When I was about 5, I asked her about you. She said—" Juniper frowned, working to get the words right. "She said you were the kind of person who held themselves to a standard that nobody could meet, and that was both the best thing about you and the thing that made you impossible to live with." She looked at him. She didn't say it mean. She said it like she understood it. Serafina had stopped pretending to look at the map on the table in front of her. She was watching Rowan. He didn't say anything for a moment. "She was right," he said finally, "about all of it." Juniper nodded once, like that settled something, and went back to the lesson. But the settling had happened in the room, not just in her. Something Alara had said to a 5-year-old and preserved there, carried up the mountain and handed to him years too late and years too necessary. He held it and went back to the harness and didn't trust his hands to be entirely steady. November came hard. It announced itself the way mountain winters do. Not gradually, not with the courtesy of a slow buildup, but with 3 days of driving gray sky and then a morning where Rowan opened the door and found 18 inches of snow and more coming. He stood in the doorway for a moment taking inventory. Wood stores, food, water pipe. All sufficient. He'd prepared for this specifically and deliberately, and everything was where it needed to be. But the mountain had closed around them, and the road to town was gone under the snow, and the 3 of them were alone in a way that was qualitatively different from the aloneness of autumn. Serafina took it in stride. She'd grown up in Missouri winters and knew cold, and she simply adapted, added layers to the morning routine, moved the lessons to the warmest corner of the main room near the stove, found ways to make the enforced closeness productive. She and Juniper baked on the snow days, working through Serafina's recipe book, and then inventing things, and the cabin smelled like bread and sometimes burnt bread, and once something that was supposed to be pie, and came out more like a flat, complicated biscuit that they ate anyway. Juniper struggled more than she let on. The snow had cut off any possibility of leaving, which she hadn't been consciously planning to do, but which the closing of the option made suddenly significant. She was trapped in an arrangement she'd agreed to provisionally, with people she was only starting to trust, and the weather didn't care about her timeline. She got quieter. Not hostile, just compressed, like she was using energy to hold something together that was getting harder to hold. Rowan noticed it and didn't name it. Serafina noticed it and gave her more physical tasks to do, which helped some: kneading dough, stacking wood on the porch, anything that gave the compressed energy somewhere to go. But the compression was building. It broke on a Tuesday evening, the same nothing day that the telegram had arrived on, which Rowan only noticed afterward. He'd been in the main room sharpening the axe near the stove, and Serafina was reading, and Juniper had come in from the back room where she'd been doing a lesson assignment, and she was carrying the illustrated book, The Mountain Folk Tales, the one she'd claimed on the first day. And her face was wrong. Not sad wrong, something tighter than that. "I've been reading this one," she said. She held it out, open to a particular page. Rowan set the axe down and looked. It was a story he knew. Most people in the territory knew it. A local legend about a mine foreman who ignored warnings and lost his crew. It was one of those stories that got attached to real events over time, embellished, changed, turned into a lesson. He'd bought the book years ago and hadn't thought about that particular story being in it. "It's about you," Juniper said. "It's based loosely on, it's about you." She was looking at him with something in her face that was almost anger, but not quite yet. "It says a man cared more about the quota than his men. It says he knew and he didn't do anything. That's a story. Stories change things." "Did you know?" Her voice had gone flat, which in Juniper was worse than volume. "You said you heard the signs and made a call. Did you know what would happen?" "No," he said. "I didn't know. I suspected something might be wrong, and I decided it was probably fine. That's not the same as knowing." "But you made the call." "Yes." "And they died." "Yes." She was holding the book so tight her knuckles were pale. "My mother was alone because you fell apart after that. You came up here and hid, and she was alone." The flatness was cracking. "She worked herself sick because you weren't there. She was sick for 2 months, Rowan. 2 months, and I watched her get smaller every week, and I didn't know what to do, and there was nobody—" Her voice broke on the last word, and she stopped. Serafina had set her book down and was very still. "I know," Rowan said. "You don't know." She was angry now, the full thing, no held-back edges. "You were up here feeling bad about yourself, and she was down there dying, and you didn't even know about me, and she never told you. And I don't know why she didn't tell you, but I know that she was alone, and I was alone, and you were up here." She stopped again, breathing hard. He stayed where he was. He didn't go toward her and didn't step back. "You're right," he said. "I know I'm right." She threw the book at the sofa, not at him, sideways, but with force. "I wish it had been you. In the mine. I wish it had been you instead of them, because at least their families had people who actually—" She stopped. Her face changed. She knew she'd gone too far. She could see it in his face, not rage. Something worse, something quieter. The words had landed, and they had done the things she'd known they would do, and now she couldn't take them back, and she couldn't hold the anger anymore because it had done too much damage. She turned and ran for the door. Not outside. The snow was deep and the cold was serious, and some instinct stopped her at the door with her hand on the latch and her forehead pressed against the wood. "Juniper." Serafina's voice low and not gentle exactly, but steady. "Come away from the door." "I didn't mean—" She couldn't finish it. Her shoulders were shaking. Rowan had not moved. He was standing in the middle of the room, and the axe was on the floor where he'd set it, and his hands were at his sides, and Serafina looked at him once, and whatever she saw in his face made her stay where she was. He walked to the door. He stopped a few feet behind Juniper. He didn't touch her. "I know you didn't mean it," he said. His voice came out rougher than he wanted. "I did mean it," she said, into the door. "I meant it because I was—" She swallowed hard. "I'm sorry." "You don't have to be sorry for being angry." "I'm sorry for what I said." "Okay." He let a moment pass. "Can you look at me?" She turned around. Her face was wet and red and undone in the specific way of a child who has said the worst thing they know and is waiting for the consequence of it. "I'm not going to tell you it didn't hurt," he said. "It did." He crouched down so he was at her level. "But I'm still here." She stared at him. "I said I'd show up," he said. "That's what I'm doing." Something went out of her all at once. Not like relief, more like a structure giving way when it's been holding too long. She made a sound that wasn't words and sat down hard on the floor right there at the door. And he sat down with her on the cold floor. And she didn't reach for him, and he didn't reach for her, but they were close. Close enough that when she pulled her knees up and put her head down, he could feel the small heat of her. Serafina stayed at the table. Juniper cried for a long time, the kind of crying that wasn't about the thing that started it. It was bigger than that. It was all the weeks of held together, and the mother, and the 4 days alone, and the orphanage she'd been afraid of, and the mountain that had closed around her and Rowan, who she didn't know how to feel about yet, and all of it coming through the one crack that had opened. He sat on the floor with her and let it happen and didn't try to stop it or shape it or make it mean something. When it finally slowed, she was leaning against him. He wasn't sure when that had happened. Her head was against his arm, and she was breathing in the uneven way of someone who has cried themselves to the edge of something. "I was scared," she said very quietly. "When I said it, I was scared you were going to... I thought maybe you'd send me away, if I made things hard enough." He was quiet for a moment. "Were you trying to make me send you away?" She thought about it. "I don't know. Maybe. It's easier if..." She stopped. "If you leave first," he said. "Or if you make someone else leave before they can choose to." She was quiet. "I know that one," he said. "I invented that one." She looked up at him. Her eyes were swollen and she looked exhausted down to the bone. "You're not going to send me away." "No." "Even when I say terrible things?" "Even then." She looked at him for a moment more and then looked at the floor and said, in a voice that was smaller than any voice he'd heard her use, "I don't want to be alone again." "You're not," he said. "You're not going to be." It wasn't a promise he had any business making. There were 100 things in the world that could break a promise like that, weather and illness and the arbitrary machinery of misfortune. But he made it anyway, because some truths need to be said even when they can't be fully guaranteed. And this one was true in the only way that mattered, which was that he meant it without reservation. Serafina made tea because tea was the thing you made when the emergency was over and the wreckage needed to be sat with. She brought it to them on the floor, which she did without comment, handing a cup to Rowan and one to Juniper, and then she went back and got her own and sat at the table, and that was that. Juniper held the cup in both hands the way Serafina always did and blew on it before she drank, and didn't seem to notice she'd adopted the habit. "I want to know about them," she said. "The men from the mine." Rowan looked at her. "If you tell me," she said, "their names, what they were like." He thought about it. Eames Colby was the oldest. He had a beard he was unreasonably proud of, and he told the same 3 jokes in rotation and thought they were funnier each time. He paused. Good worker. Careful. He'd been in mines for 20 years, and he knew things about rock that I didn't. Will Drury, he continued, quieter. He wrote letters to his wife every week, even when we were far from any post office. Just saved them up. He'd come back from a long job with a stack of letters to send, and she'd get them all at once. He stopped. Pete Drury was Will's younger brother, 23. He wasn't supposed to be on that shift. He switched with another man because the other man had a sick child. Juniper absorbed this. "Do you think about them?" she asked. "Every day." She nodded as though she'd expected that answer and needed to hear it confirmed. "Mama thought about you every day too," she said. "I know because she'd get quiet sometimes at the same time of day, in the evenings, and when I asked, she'd say she was just thinking. But it was the same time and the same kind of quiet, and I knew it was about you, even before she told me your name." She drank the tea. "I think people we've lost take up a permanent spot in us. They don't fill it, and they don't leave it. They just sit there." Serafina set her cup down very carefully. Rowan looked at this child. His child, he thought, and the word still felt like something borrowed, something that didn't yet fully fit, but more his than it had been a month ago. And he thought about all the years he'd spent up here on this mountain, carrying the weight of the dead, and the weight of the leaving, and the weight of his own insufficient self. And he thought about what she'd just said, which was the wisest thing anyone had said to him in years, and it had come from someone who was 7 years old and had lost everything and was still trying to make sense of it honestly. "You're right," he said. She looked at the fire. "I'm still angry at you," she said. "I want you to know that. It's not gone." "I know. But I think..." She frowned, working it out. I think I can be angry and also stay. Is that strange? No, Serafina said from the table. That's what families do. Juniper looked at her. Then she looked at Rowan. She looked around the cabin, the bookshelves, the stove, the carved animals on the windowsill in the other room, the mountain dark pressing against the windows. Okay, she said. Not happily. Not resolved. Not fixed. Not the end of anything. Just, okay. I'm here. I'll try. It was enough. More than enough. It was, in fact, everything. Outside, the snow kept coming down, indifferent and heavy, piling up against the door, sealing them in together. The fire made its sounds in the stove. The tea cooled, and the three of them stayed where they were on the floor and at the table, in the warm interior of the most unlikely household on the mountain, and none of them were quite all right yet, but none of them were alone. The days after the blow-up were strange in the way that days are strange after a storm, quieter than before, but not the same quiet. The air had changed. Something that had been sealed and pressurized was now open, and open things are drafty, uncomfortable, in need of tending. Juniper didn't pretend the conversation on the floor hadn't happened, which Rowan was grateful for. She just lived alongside it. She was still angry some mornings. He could see it in the set of her jaw at breakfast, the way she'd answer in shorter sentences. And other mornings she was almost easy with him, asking questions about the wood or the horse or the tracks in the snow. And he took both versions without preference because she wasn't required to be consistent, and he wasn't going to make her feel like she was. November settled into its full gray authority. The snow didn't melt between storms. It just accumulated, layer on layer, compressing at the bottom and staying loose at the top, and the drifts against the north wall of the cabin reached the bottom of the window by mid-month. Rowan dug a path to the woodpile every morning, and some mornings Juniper came out without being asked and worked the other end of the path, and they'd meet in the middle and she'd say something practical like, "This shovel's got a crack," and he'd say, "I know, I'll fix it," and that was a kind of conversation too. Serafina watched all of this and kept her own counsel. She had a quality he'd noticed early, an ability to be present without inserting herself, to observe without making the observed person feel watched. It was a teaching skill probably, the ability to stay back while staying close. He found it useful in a way he couldn't have explained except that the cabin felt steadier for having her in it, the way a table is steadier for a fourth leg. He thought about that more than he let himself fully examine. There were moments now, in the evenings mostly, when the work was done and Juniper was reading and the stove was going, when the cabin felt less like a temporary arrangement and more like something else, something that had its own weight and center. He'd catch himself noticing small things about Serafina, the way she tilted her book toward the lamp when the light was low, the specific sound of her laugh when Juniper said something unexpected, the particular gesture she made when she disagreed with something he said, a kind of slight press of her lips before she spoke. And he'd notice that he was noticing, and then he'd go back to whatever he'd been doing. He didn't examine it directly. Not yet. He had enough to manage. On the third week of November, Juniper got sick again. This time, it wasn't the same. She'd been fine at dinners. Quiet, but fine quiet. Not sick quiet. She'd eaten well and helped clear and gone to her room to read. Rowan had banked the fire and he and Serafina had sat in the main room for a while. Not talking much, just existing in the same space the way they'd gotten comfortable doing. He'd gone to the cot around 9 and been asleep within minutes because mountain winters burned through a man's energy like nothing else. He woke to Serafina's hand on his shoulder. The lamp was at a low angle. Late night or early morning, he couldn't tell yet. "Something's wrong with Juniper," she said. Her voice was controlled, but he'd learned to hear what was behind the control. He was up before she finished the sentence. Juniper was burning. Not the way she'd burned before. This was deeper, more serious, a heat that came off her like the stove and didn't let up. She was half-conscious, muttering things that didn't cohere, and when Serafina tried to get water into her, she turned her head away. "How long?" Rowan asked. "I heard her about 20 minutes ago. She may have been sick before that." Serafina had a wet cloth on her forehead and was watching her with the attention of someone trying to read a situation and not having enough information yet. "This isn't the same as before." "No," he agreed. Her breathing was wrong, shallow and fast, with a sound to it, a faint catch on the exhale. He pressed the back of his hand to her cheek and her neck and felt how uniform the heat was. Not the surface burn of a head cold, but something sitting deeper. "She needs a doctor," Serafina said. It was not a complicated statement. It was also, in the third week of November on a mountain with 2 feet of snow on the road, a statement that described a serious problem. "I know," he said. He went to the window. The snow was still falling. Not the driving kind, just steady, the kind that accumulated without drama. The road to town was probably passable with the right horse if you went carefully. Probably. In the dark, in this temperature, probably was doing a lot of work. "Doc Hirsch is in Redemption Ridge," he said. 8 miles, maybe 9 in this snow. "Can you get there?" He thought about the horse. He thought about the road. He thought about Juniper's breathing, that faint catch on every exhale. "I'll get there," he said. Serafina looked at him. "Be careful." It was not a small thing when Serafina said it. She was not a woman who said words for decoration. "You stay with her," he said. "Don't leave her alone." "I know." He dressed in the dark. Every heavy layer he owned, the oilskin coat over all of it, the gloves with the wool lining. He got the horse ready in the time it took him to stop his hands from rushing, because rushing with a horse in the cold was how you ended up with a lame animal 2 miles from anywhere. He worked deliberately. He kept telling himself to work deliberately. Before he left, he went back in to look at Juniper once more. She was lying very still under the quilts, and her chest was moving with that shallow, uneven rhythm, and her face was slack in the way of a person deeply unconscious. Serafina was in the chair beside her with the lamp turned up. He stood in the doorway for a second. "Rowan." Serafina said it quietly, not to hurry him, just to make him hear her. "She's going to be here when you get back. Go." He went. The ride to town was the longest 8 miles of his life. Not because of the horse. The horse was steady, a good mountain animal that had done worse in worse conditions. And not because the road was impassable. It was passable. It was cold and dark, and the snow made everything look the same, and there was one place where the drifts had come over the road entirely, and he had to go around through the trees and find the road again on the other side. And none of that was the problem. The problem was the sound of Juniper's breathing following him the whole way. He reached Redemption Ridge before 4 in the morning and went straight to Doc Hirsch's house, which he'd never been to, and had to ask the nightman at the stable where it was. He knocked hard enough to wake the neighbors and stood on the porch until the lamp went on inside. Dr. Marcus Hirsch was about 60, unhurried, with the slightly detached manner of a man who had been woken at all hours for 4 decades and had made his peace with it. He opened the door, looked at Rowan, and said, "Which way and how far?" 9 miles. Child, 7 years old, chest fever, high heat, shallow breathing. Hirsch was already turning away to get his bag. "Give me 3 minutes." He gave him 3 minutes. They rode back in the dark, and Hirsch was good company in the way of a man who knew when company wasn't wanted. He asked 2 clinical questions about the onset and the symptoms, got his answers, and then let the dark and the cold have the rest of the ride. Rowan was grateful for it. The sky was starting to go gray at the edges when they came up through the meadow toward the cabin. The lamp in Juniper's window was still burning. Serafina opened the door before they reached the porch. She looked at Rowan first. One straight look that took inventory and came back satisfied. He's here, he's intact. And then stepped back to let Hirsch in. The doctor was with Juniper for 20 minutes. Rowan and Serafina stood in the main room and did not speak, and did not sit down. He was aware of her beside him, of the fact that she was holding herself very still in the particular way she held herself still when she was managing something difficult. He wanted to say something and couldn't locate anything adequate. He put his hand over hers on the table. Just for a moment, just that. And she turned her hand over and held on briefly and then let go. And neither of them acknowledged it, but it happened. Hirsch came out with his bag. "Pneumonia," he said, "settling in the left lung. You got me here fast enough that we're not behind it yet." He opened the bag and took out a paper of powders. "This needs to go into warm water and into her every 4 hours. No skipping. She stays warm and still. The fever needs to break in the next day, day and a half, or we've got a harder conversation." He looked at Serafina. "You look like someone who follows instructions." "I do," she said. "Good. Keep the room warm, not hot. Don't let her sleep on her back. Prop her to the side. And get water into her however you can, even a little at a time." He snapped the bag shut. "I'll come back in 2 days if the road's passable. Send word before that if it gets worse." "How much worse is worse?" Rowan asked. "Breathing gets harder, not easier. Color goes bad. She stops being able to rouse at all." He said it straight, which Rowan respected. "You'll know. People know." He left a little after 7 and the cabin was quiet in his wake. They sat with it for a moment, the weight of the word pneumonia in the room, the specific gravity of it. "She's going to be all right," Serafina said. She didn't say it to comfort him. She said it the way she said the things she actually believed, with a flatness that was the opposite of performance. "She's healthy, and she's strong, and we caught it. She's going to be all right." "I know," he said. He didn't know, but he said it because she was right that it needed to be said. They took shifts. There was no discussion about it. It simply organized itself, Serafina taking the first stretch and Rowan taking the second, and they overlapped at the exchanges because neither of them trusted the transition to happen cleanly without both of them present. The powders went in every 4 hours, and getting them into a semi-conscious child was not simple. It took patience and repetition and a level of gentle persistence that left both of them tired in a specific way that was different from physical tiredness. On the first day, Juniper didn't know them. She was in the fever, and the fever was all she was. She spoke to people who weren't in the room, called out once for her mother, once for someone whose name neither of them recognized. Rowan sat beside her through the long afternoon and talked to her, low and steady. Not because he was sure she could hear him, but because silence felt like abandonment, and he'd done enough abandoning. He told her about the mountain, about the aspens in spring, how they turned a color that was almost too green to be real. About the creek running fast in May when the snowmelt came. About the deer that came to the meadow edge in the evenings, the same small herd, 3 does, and a buck with one antler shorter than the other from some old fight. He described things, ordinary things, the things you'd want to know about a place if you were coming to live there and needed it to feel real. Somewhere in the late afternoon of the second day, Juniper's fever broke. It didn't announce itself. Rowan was in the chair with his elbows on his knees, half dozing, when he became aware that something had changed in the room, some quality of the air, and he straightened up and looked at her and put his hand on her forehead, and the heat was gone. Not entirely. She was still warm, but the burning quality of it had dropped significantly, and her breathing was slower and the catch on the exhale was less. He sat there with his hand on her forehead and breathed. Serafina came in a few minutes later with the evening dose and stopped when she saw his face. "It broke," he said. She set the cup down and came and pressed her own hand to Juniper's forehead and held it there and closed her eyes briefly in something that wasn't relief yet, but was heading there. Juniper opened her eyes. They were glassy and she looked like someone emerging from a very long distance, but they were open and focused. "I'm thirsty," she said, in a voice like dry leaves. Serafina laughed. It was a short, exhausted sound, not elegant, completely genuine. "I know," she said. "I've got water right here." That's it. She was weak for 4 days after the fever broke. She slept most of the first 2, ate broth, asked occasional questions in a thin voice that had none of its usual sharpness. On the 3rd day, she was awake for longer stretches, and on the 4th day, she sat up in bed and asked Serafina to bring her books, which they both understood meant she was recovering. What changed in those 4 days was harder to articulate, but impossible to miss. The near miss of it, the real quality of the danger, the 2 days of not knowing, had done something to all 3 of them that the weeks of careful, gradual progress had not managed. It had stripped away the performance of it. There was no arrangement anymore, no managed distances, no provisional quality to the way they occupied the same space. There was just the fact of it, that they had been through something together and come out on the same side. Juniper felt it. On the morning of the 5th day, when she was well enough to sit at the table for breakfast, and Rowan set a bowl of oatmeal in front of her and Serafina poured the coffee, Juniper looked at the 2 of them with an expression that was entirely unguarded, something she almost never was, and said, "I thought I was going to die." "You weren't," Serafina said. "I know, but I thought I was while it was happening." She looked at the oatmeal. "I kept hearing you," she said to Rowan. "Talking. I couldn't always understand the words, but I could hear you were there." He didn't say anything. You didn't leave, she said. Not an accusation this time, an observation, a fact she was putting in the column of verified things. No, he said. She picked up her spoon. She ate a few bites and then said, without looking up, I used to think the worst thing was being alone. When Mama got sick, I was alone, and that was the worst thing I'd ever felt. She paused. But I wasn't alone this time, and it was different. It mattered that it was different. Serafina had her coffee cup and was looking at Juniper with the careful attention that meant she was hearing something important and not going to interrupt it. I'm not still angry, Juniper said to Rowan. Or, I am, a little, but it's smaller now, like it's the right size. She looked up. Does that make sense? Yes, he said. Mama would say it's because I cried it out. A slight something at the corner of her mouth. She said I always felt better after a proper cry. She said I got that from you. He made the sound that wasn't quite a laugh. It was more than the last time. She said that? She said you were the most controlled person she'd ever met until something actually broke through, and then you couldn't stop. Juniper's expression went thoughtful. She said she saw you cry exactly once, when Pete Drury's name was read at the memorial. She looked at him directly. She said she fell in love with you again in that moment because you'd finally stopped pretending you were fine. The cabin was very quiet. I didn't know she was there, he said. She was standing in the back. You didn't see her. Juniper went back to the oatmeal. She told me that story to explain why she didn't stop. She stopped, frowned, tried a different angle. She loved you until the end. I think you should know that. He could not speak for a moment. Thank you, he said. It came out rough, and that was fine. Deputy Assessor Cleary arrived on the 90th day, almost to the hour, which struck Rowan as either very precise record-keeping or a personality trait. He came up the mountain on a morning that had gone clear and sharp-edged after a week of storms. The sky, a specific winter blue that hurt to look at directly, and the snow on the ground was packed in white, and the cabin looked, objectively, like a place where people lived. Window boxes on the south side with dried herbs still in them. The woodpile covered and full, smoke from the stovepipe going straight up in the still air. Serafina had made coffee, and there was bread cooling on the table, and Juniper was at her lessons in the main room, which was not staged. This was simply what Tuesday mornings looked like now. Cleary knocked and came in and took off his hat, and looked around the room with the same careful attention he'd brought the first time. But something in it was different now. Last time he'd been looking for adequacy. This time he was looking at what had actually developed. He sat at the table. He asked his questions, the practical ones, provisions, and health and schooling. And Serafina answered most of them, and Rowan answered the ones about the structure of the place, and Juniper kept her eyes on her work but was very clearly listening. Then Cleary looked at Juniper and said, Juniper, would you tell me how things are here? She looked up from her book. She looked at Cleary with that direct gaze that still sometimes startled people who weren't expecting it. Things are fine, she said. Fine is a general word, Cleary said, not unkindly. I need something more specific than fine. Juniper set her pencil down. She thought about it for a moment with visible effort, not performing the thinking but actually doing it. I was sick last month, she said, really sick. Rowan rode to town in the middle of the night in the snow to get the doctor. She paused. Serafina didn't leave my room for 2 days. She slept in the chair. She looked at Cleary steadily. I was scared, and they were there. Cleary made a note. Do you feel safe here? He asked. Yes. Do you feel... Mr. Cleary? Juniper said it with the patience of someone who has something to say and needs to say it before the questions close the space. I came here because I had to. I didn't want to. She stopped, chose her words. I was angry about a lot of things, and I'm still working through some of those things. She glanced at Rowan briefly, and it was not a hostile glance. But this is my home. These are my people. She said it plainly, without drama, the way she said things she'd already decided about. So whatever form you need that in, put it down that way. The room was quiet. Cleary looked at Rowan and then at Serafina, and whatever he saw in their faces he kept his own counsel about. He wrote something in his folder. He closed it. Provisional period is satisfied, he said. I'll file for permanent custody on my return. You'll receive the formal documentation within the month. He stood and picked up his hat. Mr. Creed, Mrs. Creed. He looked at Juniper. You're a remarkable young woman, Miss Creed. Juniper considered this. I know, she said, which was not arrogance but simple agreement with a factual statement, and which made Serafina press her lips together to hold back something. Cleary went to the door. He paused before opening it. Take care of each other, he said. It was not an official instruction, it was just one person talking to people he'd decided were worth saying it to. That's the plan, Rowan said. He meant it more completely than he had the first time. Cleary's horse was barely out of the meadow before Juniper said, He's going to approve it, isn't he? It wasn't really a question. She was still sitting at the table with her pencil and her book, but she wasn't looking at either of them. She was looking at the door Cleary had gone through with the expression of someone who has made a calculation and is waiting for the math to confirm itself. Yes, Serafina said. Juniper nodded once. She picked up her pencil and went back to her work, and that was that, which was very Juniper. She asked the question she needed answered, and then she moved on. She didn't linger in the sentiment of a thing. Rowan had come to understand that about her. She processed quickly and privately and came out the other side already standing in the new place, already adapted. He wished he were more like that. He was not. He was the kind of person who stood in the doorway of a new thing for a long time before he walked through. He stood in the doorway of it for 3 more weeks. The formal documentation arrived on a Friday, delivered by the same post-rider who came up the mountain twice a month regardless of weather, because that was his route, and he was constitutionally opposed to letting weather have opinions about his route. Rowan signed for it on the porch and stood there in the cold reading it, and the language was legal and dense, and most of it described processes and provisions, but the operative sentence was clear enough. Permanent custody of the minor child Juniper Elara Creed is hereby granted to Rowan Creed of Redemption Ridge, Colorado Territory, effective this date. Juniper Elara. He hadn't known her middle name. Elara had given her own name as the child's middle name, which meant she'd been carrying her mother's name inside her own name this whole time, a kind of inheritance so specific and private that he hadn't known to look for it. He stood on the porch until his hands got cold, and then he went inside. Juniper was at her lessons. Serafina was at the stove. He set the document on the table, and Serafina looked at it and read the operative sentence and looked up at him. Juniper, she said. Juniper came in from the main room with a mildly put-upon expression that suggested she'd been in the middle of something. She looked at the document. She read it again. She set it back on the table very carefully, the way she set things down when she was controlling her hands. Elara, Rowan said. Your middle name. Mama gave it to me. She was looking at the document. She said it was so I'd always have her with me even when she wasn't. She paused. I never told people about it. It felt private. It's yours, he said. I'm not telling anyone. She looked at him. She'd have liked you trying, she said. I think she'd have been glad you were trying. He didn't know what to do with that. He nodded. Juniper picked up the document again and read it one more time and then set it down and went back to her lessons without another word. And the document sat on the table all day like an ordinary piece of paper that had changed everything. It was Juniper, in the end, who made Rowan stop standing in the doorway. She did it obliquely, which was her method when she wanted to move something without appearing to push it. It was a Saturday evening in late December, the 3 of them in the main room after dinner, the good fire going, snow outside making the night feel contained and close. Serafina was mending something by the lamp, and Rowan was sharpening tools at the table, and Juniper was ostensibly reading but had been on the same page for 20 minutes. Do you like each other? She asked, to no one specifically. Serafina looked up from the mending. Rowan set down the whetstone. That's an odd question, Serafina said. It's a straightforward question. Juniper still had her book open. I watch you. You're careful around each other, like you're both waiting for something. She looked up. I just want to know if you actually like each other or if this is still the arrangement. The fire made its sounds. The wind pushed at the north wall. It stopped being the arrangement a while ago, Rowan said. Juniper looked at him, then at Serafina. Then what is it now? Serafina had the expression she wore when a question had located something she'd been keeping orderly and managed, and the question had just disordered it. "It's more complicated than like," she said. "Why does complicated mean you can't say it?" "Juniper, I'm not trying to be difficult," she said, and she wasn't. Her voice was entirely without guile, just the direct pressure of a child who had spent too much of her short life watching adults not say things and was over it. "I just think if something is true, it should be sayable. Mama always said that. She said the things that are too hard to say are usually the most important ones." Serafina looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Rowan. He looked back at her. He'd been looking at her for months, carefully, from angles, the way you look at something when you're not letting yourself look at it directly. He looked at her directly now. She had a strand of hair coming loose from her braid, and there was a small burn on her left wrist from the stove she'd gotten 3 weeks ago, and she was looking at him with those dark eyes that were precise and undefended. And he thought about the woman who had been on her knees in a garden in the cold, agreeing to a desperate arrangement for the sake of a child she'd never met, and everything that had come from that. And he thought about the porch at night and the coffee and the hand on the table in Juniper's room when the fever was bad. And he thought, this is not an arrangement anymore, and hasn't been for a long time. "I love you," he said. He said it to Serafina, plainly, like a thing he'd finally decided to stop not saying. "I don't know when it started. Somewhere in the middle of everything, but I do." Serafina was very still. Juniper closed her book. "I know this isn't—" He stopped, started again. "I know what we agreed to. I'm not asking you to change anything you don't want to change. He shook his head. "Juniper's right. It should be sayable." Serafina set down the mending. She was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was deciding something, and he waited because she deserved to not be rushed. "I came here," she said, "because there was a child who needed help. That was what I told myself." She looked at her hands. "But I also came because—" She paused. "Because you asked me honestly. You didn't pretend it was something it wasn't. You said, here is a hard thing, and I need help with it. And that was—" She looked up. "I hadn't been asked honestly for anything in a long time. By anyone." He waited. "I've been afraid of this," she said. "Not you. What it means. I've been—" She stopped. Tried again. "When things went wrong before, I lost everything. The teaching, the town, She shook her head. "I built my life small so there was less to lose. And then you came to that garden and I said yes, and the life stopped being small, and I've been terrified since approximately the second week." "Of what specifically?" he asked. "That I'd need it," she said. "This, all of this." She gestured slightly. The cabin, the fire, Juniper on the sofa, him at the table. "That I'd need it, and then it would end." "It doesn't have to end," he said. "I know that's not a promise anyone can make absolutely." "No," he agreed, "but I'm making it as close to absolutely as I can." She looked at him for a long time. He let her look. "I love you too," she said. It came out quieter than his had, but it didn't need volume. It was said in the same way she said the things she'd decided thoroughly, not impulsively, not with performance, but with the full weight of having thought it through and arrived at the truth of it. Juniper made a sound that was entirely and unambiguously a satisfied exhale. They both looked at her. "Finally," she said. "You're 8 years old," Serafina said. "I've been watching you for 2 months." She had no apology in her voice whatsoever. It was obvious. "I was starting to think I was going to have to be more direct about it." "More direct than that question?" Rowan said. "I had a speech prepared," she said. "I'm glad I didn't have to use it." "What?" They told Juniper that evening what the change would look like practically, which was that it wouldn't look much different because it was already what it was. Serafina wasn't going anywhere. The cabin was her home in the same way it was Juniper's home, in the way that had developed through winter and illness and nights at the fire and arguments about history and burnt experimental baking and all the ordinary accumulation of people living together through hard things. "Are you going to move your room?" Juniper asked, with the curiosity of a child asking about logistics. "That's between Serafina and me," Rowan said. "I know. I'm just asking." "I know you're just asking," Juniper considered. "I think you should," she said. "The cot in the main room is bad for your back. I can hear you getting up in the mornings." Serafina pressed her lips together in the way she did when she was preventing a specific expression from happening. "We'll figure it out," Rowan said. I'm just saying, Juniper said, with the air of someone who has made her position known and will not be repeating it. January settled in and the mountain held them in its cold, and they were held willingly. The days had a shape now, boss. Not a rigid one, nothing that couldn't flex when it needed to, but a shape. Mornings with coffee and the stove and whoever woke first getting things started. Lessons in the forenoon, Juniper's quick mind going in 6 directions at once, and Serafina matching it, redirecting, building. Afternoons with the work of the place, Rowan and sometimes Juniper outside, Serafina inside or out, depending on the task. Evenings by the fire, reading, talking, Juniper's commentary on everything. The specific comfortable silence of people who know each other well enough to not perform. It wasn't peaceful in the way that pictures of peaceful things are. It was messier than that. Juniper had bad days where the grief came back full and heavy, and she was sharp-edged and difficult, and there was nothing to do on those days except be present and patient and let her come through it in her own time. Rowan had his own bad days, the ones where the mind came back on him, and he went quiet in a way that took up more space than his actual silence. And Serafina had learned to leave him the room to be quiet, while also not letting him disappear into it the way he used to. She'd knock on the door of his silence, not to break it, just to let him know she was on the other side. He found that mattered more than almost anything. Serafina had her own. She never said exactly what the situation in Kansas had been, the thing with the student and the school board, but there were moments when something shadowed her, some old cost she was still paying, and on those moments she was brittle in a way she didn't usually show. Juniper, who noticed everything, had started treating those moments with a specific gentleness that she'd developed entirely on her own, offering small practical things, the tea, the book, the simple company, without calling attention to why. It was one of the things about the child that undid Rowan regularly, her ability to give what she herself most needed, and to give it without making it a transaction. But sweet. But in February, on a day when the weather had cleared and the light came off the snow at an angle that made everything look outlined, Rowan went to the back of the meadow where the big pine stood and cleared away the snow at its base and sat down there for a while. He did this sometimes, not regularly, not ritually, just when he needed to be with something that was older than his problems. He thought about Eames Colby and Will Drury and Pete Drury, who had switched shifts for a man with a sick child and died for it. He thought about them the way Juniper had described, not as wounds to press, not as instruments of self-punishment, but as people who occupied a permanent spot. He let them occupy it. He sat with the weight of the fact that he had made a call that cost them, and that he would always have made that call, and also always live with having made it, and that those two things didn't cancel each other, they just both existed, side by side, in the same man. He thought the Drury children were grown now, or close to it. He thought about writing to them someday, not to explain or apologize. Those weren't things you could hand to someone like a package, but just to say that he hadn't forgotten, that their father and their uncle hadn't been forgotten, that the man who had made the call was still carrying it and would keep carrying it because carrying it was the least he could do. He didn't know if that letter would ever be wanted, but he thought he would write it anyway. He sat under the pine until the cold got serious, and then he walked back to the cabin and the stovepipe was still putting up its smoke, and there was lamplight in the window, and through the glass he could see Serafina at the table, and Juniper across from her with her arms going in the expansive way she used when she was making a point she considered important. He stood there for a minute in the cold just looking. He had not earned this. He wanted to be clear with himself about that, not in the self-punishing way, not as a reason to take it away from himself, just as a fact worth holding accurately. He had made the bad call. He had let Alara go without going after her. He had spent 3 years on this mountain shrinking himself down to a size that required nothing of the world and nothing of himself. And none of that had been right. He knew that. And yet, here was the thing about redemption that he was only now understanding. At 34, in the cold in front of a lit cabin on a mountain in winter, it didn't come as a verdict. Nobody handed it to you. The inquiry didn't grant it, and the suffering didn't earn it, and the years of self-imposed isolation definitely didn't produce it. It came, if it came at all, through the daily accumulation of choosing differently. Showing up, staying, saying the hard thing instead of the comfortable thing, Sitting on the floor of your own cabin with a grieving child and not leaving, even when the words were terrible, even when you deserved them. It came through action, small and repeated, and you didn't get to know in advance if it was going to be enough. He went inside. Juniper looked up from the table and said, "You're going to track snow everywhere." "I know," he said, and stamped his boots at the door. "There was an argument about the Louisiana Purchase," Serafina said, without particular urgency. "I know when it happened," Juniper said. "I just think the price was too low. It was $18 million for all that land in 1803. Still." Juniper's expression was the one she wore when she was not actually going to concede, but was out of immediate ammunition. "It seems like they could have gotten more." Rowan sat down at the table and poured himself the coffee that was still warm on the stove and said, "The French needed the money. Jefferson knew it. It was a buyer's market." Juniper pointed at him. "See, that's what I'm saying. Jefferson could have pushed." "Jefferson was afraid Napoleon would change his mind," Serafina said. "So he paid too much." "He paid too little. That's the whole point. For France. For America it was—" Juniper stopped, made a face that suggested the math had just caught up with her position. "Fine, fine. You're right." "I know," Serafina said mildly. Juniper looked at Rowan. "She always sounds like that when she's right." "Has she always sounded like that?" "For as long as I've known her," he said. Serafina looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup, and the look was warm and dry, and everything in it that he'd been careful about for months was just openly there. And he let it be openly there. And it was fine, and it was better than fine. Certi. Spring came the way spring comes at altitude. Not gradually, not generously, but in fits and arguments with winter, a warm week followed by a late storm followed by 2 warm weeks, back and forth, until finally the balance tipped and the snow started going for real, and the creek went from its winter whisper to its spring roar, and the aspens put out their first tentative color. Juniper went out into the mud of the first real thaw and stood in the middle of the meadow with her face up and her eyes closed for a long moment, and then came back in with muddy boots that she left on the porch and mud on her hem and said, "It smells different than Kansas." "Better or worse?" Serafina asked. "Different," she said. "Better in some ways, just different." She sat at the table and pulled off the muddy boots and looked at them. "I don't think about Kansas as much as I used to." "Is that good?" Rowan asked. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about things. "It's not that I'm forgetting," she said. "It's more like it moved. Mama and Kansas and all of it moved to a different place, not further away, just—" She searched for the word. "Settled, like it found where it lives." He thought about the permanent spot, the things you'd lost that sat in you without filling or leaving. "Your mother would have liked this place," he said. Juniper looked at him. "I know. She liked mountains. She used to talk about seeing them someday." She paused. "I think she'd have liked you better now than she did before." "I think so too," he said, which was not self-pity, but just honesty. "I'm better now than I was before." "You're still not great at apologies," she said. "No. And you overchop wood. You don't need that much wood." "I like chopping wood." "That's a different thing than needing it." She picked up her boots. "But you show up." Serafina said that's the main thing. Showing up is the main thing. She went off to clean the boots, and Rowan sat at the table, and Serafina came and sat across from him, and the spring light was coming through the window at that particular early angle that made everything look provisional and new. "She's going to be all right," he said. "She already is," Serafina said. "She's been all right for a while. She's building on top of it now." He thought about that. Building on top of all right. That was what they were all doing, maybe. Not getting over things, not replacing them, but building on top of them. The losses and the bad calls and the years of small contracted living. All of it still there under the foundation. But something new on top. Something inhabited and real. "I want to stay here," he said. "Not just here. Here with you, with both of you, for the long part." "I know," Serafina said. "I'm saying it clearly so it's clear." "It's clear." The corner of her mouth moved. "It's been clear for a while." I was slow. "You were careful," she said. "There's a difference." She reached across the table and her hand was there the same way it had been in Juniper's room during the fever, available, and he took it the same way, and this time nobody let go. There are things about that mountain cabin that stay fixed in the mind when you look back on them, years later. The way the aspens looked in October, the gold of them against the pine dark, like the mountain was trying to show off before winter shut it down. The way Juniper laughed when she finally learned to reshoe a horse without assistance and stood up and announced that she had mastered it with the absolute conviction of someone who has been working toward a thing for months. The way Serafina read aloud in the evenings, her voice steady and clear. The three of them settled around the fire like the arrangement had always existed. These are the ordinary things. They accumulate over years until they are the texture of a life. Rowan thought, sometimes, about what a life that was constituted of ordinary things meant. He had spent years afraid of needing things, because needing things meant losing them. And he'd organized himself around that fear so thoroughly that he'd almost lost the capacity for the needing altogether. And then a telegram had arrived on a nothing Tuesday, and a woman had been on her knees in a cold garden, and a 7-year-old child had shown up on a pony with too little coat for the weather and all her grief held together by sheer will, and the organized, careful life had become something else. He thought about Pete Drury switching shifts for the man with the sick child. He thought about the randomness of it, how one ordinary choice changed everything downstream. He'd spent 3 years treating that randomness as an indictment, as evidence of his insufficiency, as proof that things he touched came apart. He was only now beginning to understand that the same randomness that had made the mind collapse had also sent the telegram on that Tuesday, had also put Serafina in that garden, had also put Juniper on that pony. The same machinery that broke things put things together. It didn't absolve him of the call he'd made, but it suggested that the story didn't end at the worst moment, that there was more after the worst moment if you stayed present for it. Staying present was the whole work. He understood that now. Not achieving the right outcome, not earning the good ending, not being sufficient, just staying, just not leaving, just being the person who was still there the next morning, and the one after that, and the one after that. Serafina understood something different, or maybe the same thing from a different angle. She had spent years making herself small after the thing in Kansas, building a life without enough surface area for real loss. She had understood it as protection. What she'd learned on the mountain was that the protection had also been a kind of damage. You can't wall out the loss without walling out the rest of it too, and the rest of it was the thing worth having. The courage was not in surviving the loss. The courage was in choosing to need things again after you knew what losing them felt like. That was the actual hard thing, and she had done it imperfectly, afraid the whole time, and it had led here. And Juniper. Juniper grew the way children grow when they're properly held. Not smoothly, not without setbacks, but forward. She was 10, and then 12, and somewhere in that time she stopped being the child who had arrived on the pony with her grief in a bundle and became something else. Something that held the grief in a different configuration, integrated rather than carried. Her mother's memory a thread woven in rather than a weight set apart. She talked about Alara naturally. Mama used to say, Mama would have thought, the way you talk about people who are real and permanent even when they're gone. She gave that to Rowan, those references, without making a ceremony of it, just including him in the ongoing conversation with a woman neither of them had gotten enough time with. She was sharp and direct and occasionally exhausting, and she had a quality, that child, of going at the truth without flinching that Rowan recognized as something of himself and something of Alara and something that was purely her, that had developed in her through the specific conditions of her life and was nobody else's. She was remarkable. Cleary had said it on the first day, and he had been right. One evening in Juniper's 12th year, she and Rowan were out at the fence line checking the posts after a hard winter, the late afternoon sun coming slant through the upper pines, and the meadow going the particular green it went in May. She said, without preamble, "Do you think you're a good person now?" He considered the question. She was 12 and she meant it seriously, and she deserved a serious answer. "I think I'm a person who tries harder than I used to," he said. "Whether that makes me good depends on who you ask. I'm asking you. Then I think I'm better than I was, and not as good as I'd like to be. Which is probably where most people live." She thought about this. Mama would say that's honest, at least. What would you say? She looked at the fence post she was checking, testing it with both hands. "I'd say you stayed," she said. "You stayed and you kept showing up and you didn't make me pretend things were fine when they weren't." She shrugged, one shoulder, the gesture she used when she was saying something important and didn't want it to be obvious how important. That counts for a lot. Maybe most of it. He went back to the fence post he was working on. After a while, she said, "I'm glad I came here." "I'm glad you came here too," he said. "I mean, I know you didn't choose it exactly. The telegram, I chose it," he said. "Every day after the telegram was a choice. I chose it." She looked at him. "So did Serafina," he said. "She chose it when she didn't have to. Every day she chose it." Juniper looked at this mountain line, the way the ridge went dark against the last of the afternoon sky. She had her mother's eyes and his jaw and something of her own that was neither, some quality that was specifically and entirely hers. "I think that's what family is," she said, "not the people you start with, the ones who keep choosing." He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The meadow held its green in the last light. The creek was loud below them, running fast with the snowmelt, carrying everything forward the way water does, without sentiment, without pause, toward wherever it was going next. And the two of them stood at the fence line in the May evening, a man who had learned the hard way that staying was the only kind of strength that mattered, and a 12-year-old girl who had survived being left and found her way to being found, and the mountain held them both without comment, the way mountains do, indifferent and permanent and vast enough to contain all of it. The loss and the grief and the bad calls and the fear and the choosing over and over to stay. That was the whole of it. That was everything.